And in this episode, have you ever wondered how important user research really is for startups? Well, that's exactly what we're going to help you with on this week's show, where you'll hear how Steve Sanderson discovered the power of well-done and early user research on the success of startups. Today, I'm talking with Steve Sanderson. Steve is a hands-on product development executive with a passionate focus on startups and creating products that make a measurable difference. For most of his career, he has worked on early-stage startups with a strong emphasis on lean startup and customer development for the last 6 years. Currently, he is the resident lean startup expert at Rackspace, where he is focused on applying lean startup and customer development into larger environments with high degrees of uncertainty. Now, I want to go back to the early days of the lean startup movement. Tell us about the company that you started and what you learned from customer research in the early days.
Definitely. So I was lucky enough to meet someone that worked really closely with Eric Ries while Eric was creating the whole lean startup idea and codifying it in his blog and his book. And I'd been struggling with how to take an existing company and figure out pricing. And pricing to me, I didn't understand pricing. My background as an engineer who, had a field promotion to CEO, I didn't know what to do about pricing. And so through investors, I met this guy, Manuel, and we ended up talking about pricing. And the thing that really stuck in my head that completely sort of short-circuited me was pricing doesn't matter. What price I think doesn't matter. What really matters is pick a number, pick a different number, and start running comparisons. And he was describing how to start running experiments. And of course, at the time, my naive view on this was, well, what about our brand? What about if people hear about this? And he was honest in a way that I've copied. He looked at me and said, "You don't have a brand. Your company is so small. You have nothing to lose. And if your customers hear that you have different packages, different pricing, send them a box of flowers or a box of cookies, and just love them, and it'll all work out." And he was absolutely right. We didn't ever get a chance to apply that to the company I was the CEO for at the time, but he and I went on and started a company, Food on the Table. And Manuel was the CEO, and I was the first employee, head of development. And because we were close to Eric and a lot of other people in the lean startup movement, I basically drank from the fire hose of how to think entirely differently about not only building a product, but building a business. And it really reformed my idea of where I wanted my career to go, because I went from thinking there was some magic that these people had that I just had never been read in on, to realizing that it could all be formed as hypotheses and tested and experimented with to figure out what was facts versus what was opinions. So that was how it got started.
Oh, that's great. And it's definitely something I've heard a lot about, is that kind of feedback around pricing and concerns that if you show two different prices, people get concerned. So it sounds like a great solution to just keeping customers happy and acknowledging it.
Completely counterintuitive to what everybody else was telling me, but it appealed to me because it made sense.
Did you end up getting to a point where you had customers who noticed?
So interesting story. This is the pre-Food on the Table company. And this is worth talking about as we talk through the value of research and experimentation. The team I had, an awesome team at the time, struggled with the idea of publicly showing something that we weren't absolutely certain of. So they were really struggling with the idea of putting out a product that wasn't perfect. They were struggling with the idea of putting out a pricing model that wasn't perfect. And the implication, of course, is that somewhere, somehow, there was a way to figure out perfect without ever actually talking to the customers. And that's the bind that we got stuck in. And as a first-time CEO, I was stuck in it. when we went to food on the table and we began to do pricing, we iterated through so many variations of pricing. We ended up, when we finally wrapped up food on the table, it was sold over, a couple million subscribers, lots of different packages, lots of different options, lots of different forms. I do not believe we ever had anybody call and say, I'm using this consumer product and I saw that somebody else is getting a better deal than me. And had that ever happened, I know we would have literally sent cookies and treated it as an opportunity to win them back.
Yeah, we often have the sense that our customers are paying really close attention to all the details of what we're doing, right?
Yeah. I think it's much like high school dances or middle school dances. We think that everybody's watching us and they're extremely concerned with whatever it is we do. And honestly, they're not, and they don't care. They really only care about the impact that we make in their life, not a lot of the sausage making along the way.
And you're a mentor at Capital Factory, and it sounds like you get to work with lots of startups at lots of stages. What are some of the things that you see other entrepreneurs struggle with?
Yeah, that's there's many answers to that. I'll pick some of my favorites. What I'll say is, and we'll touch on this later. One of the things I've noticed is there are patterns. After having mentored a lot of different folks and talked to a lot of other mentors, been on both sides of that conversation as a mentor and a mentee, there are definitely repeated patterns. So frequently people struggle with understanding what a true problem is, a true need is for somebody. Many times when I'm talking to an early stage startup, I'll ask them, what is the need you're solving for? What is the struggle that they're having? I'll ask it a couple different ways depending upon what fits in our conversation. And inevitably, if I hear, there's a few answers. Some of them are very clear. Oh, this is the struggle they're having. But for many of them, they proceed to describe their solution. Well, they need, fill in my solution. It's like, that's not actually the struggle they're having. They didn't wake up and think, this is what I need. I need Bob's, fancy, shiny app widget. They didn't do that. So, okay, let's back up. And so that's fun, is actually going through the dialogue with them to try and unpack what is the real problem and getting them to notice the severity of the struggle that the person's having. So they're blinded by the solution. They think that's the problem. And as a result, they're not even yet noticing the pain that their target has. It's all there. They just haven't gotten to it yet.
Yeah, and there's several ways to get there. So I'm curious about how you approach it, because it's sometimes as simple as asking a couple of questions like, so that what thing is getting solved or what problem is getting solved, but then other times you need more research. So what have you found is like the right way to start if entrepreneurs find themselves stuck in answering that question and they're just talking about the solution?
So there's an interesting relationship between research and entrepreneurialism. And that is the tactics. I'm going to give a meta answer and then the answer. One thing I discovered working at Food on the Table and then later on at other places is that everybody wants to do what they know how to do well. So software developers want to develop software really well. Designers want to design really well. Researchers want to research really well. That's sometimes in conflict with what's good enough at that point in time. And so part of what really appealed to me with the lean methodology is what's the minimal amount of effort that needs to be put in something to actually produce the information, the knowledge, the thing that lets you move forward to the next step. So, so when it comes to understanding, now to answer your actual question, when it comes to understanding the problem, depending on who I'm talking to, builder, they're going to want to build the solution and tell me that that's the problem. if they've got a really strong orientation towards research, and this happened the other day, I was mentoring someone, they described what is what I think of as an ideal research, design thinking, solutioning, as they called it, process, and how they had gone through with it. Only what they had focused on wasn't the thing that was really killing the customer. They were focused on, in this case, the user experience, not the underlying benefit or your problem that needed to be solved for the potential customer. So I usually guide in mentor sessions my entrepreneur, the person across the table, to start bottoms up, very, very scrappy. And what I'm telling him is, you want to be able to bump into this person in the elevator. Success is when you can bump into this person in the elevator, or you can go into a room, and first off, you can pick them out. So you know them well enough to qualitatively pick them out based on what they say or do or act, whatever the characteristics are. And then if you were to go to them and say, how's it going with blah, 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 nice open-ended question, you want them to body language say, ugh, it's, and then have some emotional response. And again, I didn't realize the value of this in entrepreneurialism until having gone through the whole lean startup work. Manuel had a background in marketing, and I had a background in technology. So again, I came at it from let's build, let's design, let's create. We would be having these interviews with, in our case, they were typically moms who were responsible for cooking, shopping, preparing, serving dinner. And we would do a roundtable. We'd get a bottle of wine, some cheese, we'd sit around somebody's table and we'd talk to them. One time when we were doing early customer interviews, try and really understand the problems around this market that Food on the Table was targeting, we did a group of interviews with typically moms, probably a half a dozen or so around a table, sometimes a bottle of wine, some cheese. And one particular conversation I really remember was we were talking to this group of folks, and this lady started to describe how her stepson didn't like her cooking, didn't like the meals she prepared. So the more she told the story, the more she got upset and really was having some strong feelings. And I was comfortable with that, but my background as a technology builder, I wasn't sure what to do with her feelings after the fact. And I was talking to Manuel, who had a entirely different background, more of a marketing background and product management background. And he saw the emotions as a great signal that there was a lot of feelings behind what was going on, and really opened my eyes to the idea that we want to be looking for problems that have a strong emotional component to them. And that's something that we don't discover through quantitative research. We only get it through qualitative research. So when I'm mentoring someone or I'm advising a company, what I'm trying to help them do is make sure that they not only have understood the users and what jobs they're trying to get done, but really try and understand where are they having emotional feedback, emotional consequence about the problem. And it isn't necessarily a problem that I would think would cause emotional struggle. There's a company in ed tech I had that focused on administrators dealing with managing data around accountability so they hit their numbers. It became emotional for them because they were using days and weeks of their time, of their teachers, of their staff. The consequences of getting it wrong meant somebody's job might be on the line. So there was some feelings around that. So when I'm trying to help someone narrow down what the problem really is, I want them to be able to walk into a room, see if they can find the people in the room by understanding what they're trying to get done, and be able to talk to them and reliably get an emotional response from somebody that tells us this is an important problem. If they're indifference, we're not going to get, yes, it may be a problem, but it's not an important problem.
Yeah, it's not very motivating. It sounds like if you've got the emotion, you want it to subside or be met in some way. Do you recommend any specific techniques to get at this emotion, or any specific questions that you've seen help unlock this?
Yeah, I think, and it somewhat depends on the founder or the team that I'm talking to. Some folks are really comfortable asking close-ended questions that really start pushing towards very discrete answers. Is this good for you? Is this bad for you? Very concrete. So getting them to understand open-ended questions, getting them to understand questions that don't lead the witness. Have you stopped beating your wife yet? Not a great question. Doesn't get you a lot of information. So some basic fundamentals about user research that I think most researchers would probably think of as 101 is surprisingly hard for a lot of people. And I think it's directly correlated to how strongly invested you are in the solution, because our egos get really wrapped up in it. So some of my advice is try and imagine it's not you. Try and imagine it's not about your solution. It's about their problem. It's true regardless of whether your solution is there or not. And so some basic questions are, go in and ask, tell me a story. Tell me a story about, in the food on the table example, tell me a story about what it's like around mealtime, shopping, cooking, preparing, serving. In the EdTech example that we had at my last company, EdSite, it was, tell me a story around managing accountability for this particular accountability regime. And listen well enough that you're trying to find, is there any kind of emotional reaction during it? Not where you're expecting it, but just listen for it. And I have to say that it's not always that people are trained to be comfortable asking questions that are going to elicit feelings. Some of us are more inclined than others to avoid that. They even know, if I ask somebody about this, I may hear that they're unhappy about it. They may have some strong feelings, and they may not be feelings I'm comfortable with. And so I like to try and take the founder to a place. Can you ask a question, and will you be okay with them giving you a really strong response? And pace them, try to understand how you talk about it with them. So I think I would open with, ask them to tell you stories about a particular situation. And if you can consistently get an emotional response from that, now you've found a vein of gold. Now you can start using some more tools to try and mine what's there.
And I'm hearing what you're saying here as well, is that you're asking about what has been, like bringing up emotions in a story or an experience, and not necessarily asking about the future and what they might imagine.
Yeah, that is a really good one. And I think I'll only speak for myself, but it certainly didn't occur to me until I had been trained that I didn't want to ask about the future in a lot of ways, in most ways, actually. And I think it finally came home for me when I did enough sort of reading and learning about psychology to understand that people are lousy predictors of their own futures, of pretty much any future, but certainly of their own. And the story I love to explain this to people is, first off, we always want to ask as much as possible about what's happened already and get them to fill in the story about that, because that's going to be based on reality, not interpretation or speculation. But the reason why we don't want to ask them, what would you do if, or given my baby is really beautiful, tell me the different ways you would be so happy with it. The example that I always like to trot out is the story about when Netflix used to have queues of shows that you could create in anticipation of what you were going to watch, some night or some weekend.
Mhm.
Apparently Netflix did a study about what people say they want to watch and what they actually watch. And basically it roughed out to people put on their list what they think they ought to be watching. Schindler's List, documentary about the evolution of grass, a show on post-capitalist economics. What they watch is, the latest show from the Avengers, and, they binge watch, something, fantasy show. Nothing wrong with that, but as a predictor, it's basically useless. And we want them to tell us about repeated experiences and get the emotional response from those prior experiences.
Between a test, research, hypothesis, there's all this language around experimentation culture. How do these pieces fit together, and where should startups be focusing their energy?
Yeah, so here's my heuristics for this. Early on, we're going to want to do qualitative research. It can be story driven, like I mentioned. Tell me about what are your struggles with, until you're almost able to, not almost, until you can predict the answer in the conversation. And I knew we were nailing it in multiple companies when I was able to find the person that I thought fit our target, ask them some questions, and predict what they were going to say, with reasonable accuracy before they said it. That's the point when it was like, okay, my questions, I can move on. And I'll give credit to Laura Klein, who wrote a great book, and I got to work with to help me understand that. The qualitative questions, getting to the point where we've internally patterned them well enough. We're now, in our heads, we have the model. Once we have the model, we got to get it out of our heads and into a form that everybody else in the team can use. So now we can start shifting to experimentation, more quantitative pieces. So I'm a big fan of the model of creating a set of assumptions that underlie the model of change that you have. So when I think about building a startup, in the best case, I'm describing the change in the world that I want to create. And I'm describing a sustainable group of people that are going to do this, not just once, but over and over again for a large population. So with that as my view about how a startup is, you build a model. And, the most conventional models today are Ashmoria's Lean Canvas, and Osterwalder's business model canvas and his value proposition canvas. Those are great tools. There's pieces missing from them, but to get started, fill them in, but use them to drive creating a list of assumptions. And then from there, identify the assumptions that are the life-threatening assumptions, the ones that if they're wrong, your model, your beautiful thing that you're imagining just isn't going to work. So, if you can't actually provably show you can contact someone with this problem over and over again, you don't have a startup, not yet. So I want to understand from a qualitative point of view. I want to internalize it well enough to be able to then create a list of assumptions. I want to organize those assumptions against what is the biggest risk of being wrong, the biggest consequence of it being wrong, and then and assumptions are hypotheses. Those are basically, I use those terms interchangeably, and so based on a hypothesis, I now want to go out and create some form of test that allows me to validate or invalidate if that assumption or hypothesis is true or false. And even the language around this one is tricky because so many people talk about it in terms of, I have a hypothesis, I want to prove that it's true. And it's like, no, you don't. You want to test to see its truth or falseness. Because if you've got skin in the game on the answer, then you're putting your fingers on the scale about what the answer is. And you're not getting the full benefits of the work you're doing. So key to that is, once you've got a well-formed hypothesis, is to go create the right kind of experiment to test it. And that in itself is a art and a skill. It's taken me years to get comfortable with it. And it's one of the funnest parts. That's a bad word. Funnest? That's not a real word. It's one of the most fun parts of doing a new venture, is testing these hypotheses, figuring out really creative, quick ways to test. And so when I think of, and I want to incorporate sort of a question that you've asked about user research, I think user research has two connotations for me. One is there are experts in user research who have a tremendous set of skills that can be used in different situations to do different kinds of research. And then there's research on users, which incorporates the notion of someone like me who's not professionally trained using some of those tools. What I have found, just like with great designers, great software developers, that it's frequently challenging for user researchers, experienced professionals, to know when it's okay to pull out a rock and a stick and do an experiment with that versus something that's at the top of the art, you know, in a double-blind study with a mirrored room, with a peer-reviewed set of questions. Sometimes that level isn't necessary to allow us to move on to the next step. So there is an art to figuring out what degree of goodness you want to dial in on, you know, software development, design, user research. And so from my perspective, an ideal case would be someone who is very skilled at user research, but has no problem putting on, you know, their boots and wading in the mud and doing something very low fidelity that's capable of getting an answer to the question very quickly enough to either reinforce one direction or change into a different direction.
Yeah, that brings to mind to me this idea of like bringing together multiple sources of research, where instead of doing like the perfect research, you get a signal on a couple different ways of getting data. So whether that's like you've got some statistics and then you've talked to a few people and those things align. Are there ways that you think about different data points that come together to look at the assumptions so that it is that lean research, just like get the quick answer because you've got multiple signals?
Yeah, that's a toughie, because I always feel like I'm learning how to do that over and over again, to combine multiple sources like that. What I used to do, and this is less relevant now, what I used to do was when I would engage someone who would be involved in user research, is I wanted to understand if their comfort level spanned the spectrum from that, you know, extremely well-designed test back down to, I'm just going to call a bunch of people on the phone, I'm going to ask them 3 questions, you know, we're going to just pop through this puppy in hours. If they did that, then I felt confident that we'd be able to manage the different signals well, because the user researcher came in knowing this space way better than I could. So they'd be able to incorporate, but it's hard to find. It was especially hard at the beginning of the lean startup stuff. I think it's less so today. It's hard to find researchers who are comfortable spanning that spectrum and knowing when to dial it into one versus the other. So if I had a strategy, it would be find someone who really understands user research and at the same time is willing to do whatever we call that low end version, and depend on their professional expertise.
And so when would you recommend entrepreneurs bring in a researcher like that? And are there certain things that you might ask to get that answer from the researcher that they're going to be able to span those different levels of fidelity?
So if I could build a dream team early on, I would include someone with that capabilities very early, in that, so that their relationship wasn't transactional. It wasn't, I've got a problem, now dial them in, let them go. And let me tell you a story about, at Food on the Table, we had, we did the user research. Manuel and I, we did the user research ourselves. And as we built up enough understanding, essentially we were laying what were the facts down from and separating out our opinions, we were able to start building the minimal viable product. We started very early with something that was all manual, a concierge model, and then over time built it up. We forcibly never turned off our progress to engage in long-term research. So there were points where we said, oh, well, something's really not right here. We need more information. We need to learn some more about what's going on with the users. The conversations we would have with people that would help us, some of them wanted to essentially prepare a research proposal, go away, they would do the research, and then many weeks, they would come back and hand us the answer. I don't know enough to sell myself as a user researcher or as a designer. I do know that what we were able to say is, if you can't work in a model where you're producing new learnings on a frequent basis, then you're probably not aligning with how we're going to progress through this startup. So a transactional big research study just doesn't fit with how we need to continually learn and course correct. And so that immediately weeded out a bunch of user research folks, because it just wasn't their repertoire. Fortunately, Manuel knew someone named Laura Klein, who worked with Eric and him at InView. Laura had written a number of books, was well known, and besides being a great character, she was capable of spanning that continuum. So she basically joined us, even though she wasn't part of the core team. She very quickly became part of the core team. She was able to engineer the tests herself, some qualitative research, and then she started turning into quantitative research by being able to mock up enough of the changes she was talking about. So she had enough of an engineering background that she was able to put some things together. And so she would test and learn, and very quickly in her research process, we would start to feed them back what she learned back into the mainstream of the product that we were advancing, of the business we were advancing. And so that was a combination I'd never seen before. And it took a couple weeks to sort of get the information flowing, but she'd be able to find insights, and we'd be able to, she'd have some degree of validation of them. We would then incorporate them into the main line and test them. And, a lot of times they aligned with what she learned in her smaller research, and sometimes they didn't. Sometimes at scale, we got different answers than she had in smaller samples. But that pattern, to me, sort of spoiled me how I would want to keep doing research all along. That it's never a go offline, go away, come back from the mountain with the answer. It's just, I have been in businesses where that's how we operate, in big companies. And I don't actually think that the research frequently produces the impact in those companies, and it's not even feasible in a startup.
And so with this continuous research process, it sounds like you've had an opportunity to work with researchers and people who could just ride alongside you and pass that feedback around the assumptions.
Yes.
What about startups that don't have those resources yet? What do you think the right frequency of research is, or how big should the research be as they're thinking about this?
So that's a great question. And, one way we work around that is people like me learn enough to be dangerous. And so we can get some of the early research done. And And the good news is we're really working on sort of the 80-20 principle here. If I can't find the ocean by driving west or east, then the ocean isn't big enough. So the problems that I might, and maybe a core team at a very early stage need to answer are so big that they don't require a lot of nuance. You know, is there a mountain over there? Is there an ocean over there? Can we find them? Okay, great, I found them, cool. Now, in order to use that, we do need more subtlety, we need more nuance. So bringing in a user researcher, someone who can use that and incorporate that back into the continuous flow of the company working makes more sense. Having said that, there's an interesting possibility here where user researchers who themselves want to be involved in early stage startups as mentors, as advisors, could, if they have the comfort to span that spectrum, could become somebody that sits on the sidelines and, you know, whispers in the ear of, you know, the few people on the core team at the beginning. And then over time, if this is a compelling enough opportunity, the founders, the entrepreneurial team, ought to be able to convince the user researcher to spend more time and bring them further and further into the fold. So to me, it's a way for user researchers to possibly join that entrepreneurial journey, to bring their brand of thinking into it, but do it without asking a user researcher to either get nothing or asking a team to, you know, write a big check for something that, you know, valuable, but could be done at a smaller cost in a much more scrappy way.
And I wanted to come back to a term you used earlier, because I found it really, it was very interesting to hear it. So you talked about the problem, knowing the problem that you're solving, more important than the solution. But instead of talking about the business being about a solution or a product, I heard you use the word change. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so I'm going to wear my politics on the sleeve a little bit. Part of what happened to me after I was lucky enough to be involved with all the lean startup work, I went and did some basically in-house entrepreneurial work for Rackspace. Great experience, but really wanted to use what I knew in a way to do impact beyond just making the world safe for more internet plumbing. And so, you know, I wanted to do something that had impact. And so I kept trying to figure out, how do I take what I'm learning, what I've learned in context outside of the obvious, let's build a unicorn. And over time, and Eric Ries really speaks to this in his first book. He talked about that a startup is really a new venture with a group of people in a condition of uncertainty. So with that as a lens, you're really saying, you know, whether my goal is to have a unicorn exit, whether my goal is to create a nonprofit impact organization, I'm looking to create change in some setting, in some system through the venture that I'm creating. And when I started framing my work in that way, I was able to start pulling in more tools. A lot of systems thinking work. Donella Meadows would be one that I'd recommend. She's got a great book and this thing she calls the 12 levers of change. I'm probably butchering her description, but it's how to think about changing a system. And when I look at the work that I've done and the work that I want to do, what really gets me up is, how am I creating sustainable change in an organization? And more importantly, have I picked an organization and a set of problems that are meaningful to me, like education versus, you know, more cloud servers, which is fine, but not, you know, not the problem I want to solve. So when I think of what we're doing, is I'm really trying to create an organization that's sustainable, which means that what its outflow is and what its inflow is has to produce life. It has to continue to function. And that it is integral to another part of some other system, and ideally it's creating an improvement in that system, that it's solving something that was not solvable before. But here's the pragmatic benefit of thinking that way. And I continually, this is one of the things, repeated things that happens when I'm mentoring. And I love doing this. And I'll give you, I'll change the names or change the terms a little bit. Was talking, to illustrate an example, was talking to a early stage founder, had found a market that needed expertise to come out and monitor some remote location. So typically the way the system worked today is there were these experts who would have to drive out to some location, monitor activities of some other group of people, and verify that, yep, they're doing the right thing, they finished this thing, they can get money from the bank, or they can get, they can keep going. He was coming up with a way to automate that, to make that a more affordable process for somebody in that system. But the way he was thinking about it was very focused on his solution and not the problem. So a lot of the conversation centered around, should I hire this kind of engineer? And so when we got to the point where I understood the pattern that he was in, the trap that he was in, and this is the fun part of being a mentor, is I got to say, don't hire a software person. And as a software person, I'll tell you, I can testify that you shouldn't hire a software person right now. Because what's really important in all this, nobody cares about your software. Nobody cares about your company. They care about the change you're creating in that system. So what's another way for you to create that change? And he just sort of blank stare. It's like, oh, well, what if you found an out of work person that knew how to do that and connected them with a set of video cameras and just had them produce the same result for the buyer that your fancy software is going to do someday. Mm-hmm. But now you're just hiring a human who is pretty incredible at doing this already to do the work. And by the way, when they do it the first time, the second time, the third time for the first, second, or third customer, and you monitor what they do, you're going to start finding where the points of friction are. And that's the piece you want to automate. So you're going to deliver value from day one, because people aren't buying your software. They're buying the change, the impact. They don't care how you do it. They don't care about you or me. They really care about that result. And, light bulbs, head explode. They got it. And he went from, it's 6 months before I can start generating revenue, improve something, to I can go hire this guy who's almost certainly out of work, set up this goofy system, and start generating actual value and get money back. And we did that at Food on the Table. We literally designed the web app on a whiteboard, and then we went and did it all by hand for one mom at Starbucks. And we met her for Starbucks just an hour before she went shopping. Manuel interviewed her, asked her the questions, showed her the pieces of paper that we thought were going to be the screens. I madly typed her answers into spreadsheets. By the time we were done with an hour, I printed out her shopping list of what was on sale at her store, a menu items, and how to go get in the store, save money, cook well. And we didn't use computers other than like Excel and Google Docs to capture our work. So she didn't care that. She thought it was kind of novel that two dudes were sitting there talking to her about meal planning. Didn't matter to her that's how we did it. Second week, we did it again. She liked it, and we got her to pay us. She wrote a check. We generated revenue from the very beginning. So in almost every problem, it's possible to do that if you think about that the results that you're getting are the change in their system, not you're producing a solution. You're producing some cool code or building a new widget. And there's some markets where you can't do that in. I wouldn't do that in healthcare or, administering medicine or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't do that if I were writing new software for a fighter jet. There's some things it just doesn't work, but almost every market you can figure out some way to do something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it only works, I think, because you reframe the problem.
Steve, that was such a great story. Thank you for sharing it. What an inspiration to walk away with, thinking about what's the way to solve for the user instead of thinking about your own solution. So thanks for sharing that today. I know that you have a giveaway for our audience today, so I wanted to give you a chance to explain what that's all about.
Sure. So one of my long-term passions is that there is a class of problems that we can solve with automation. And I think one of those set of problems, there's several of them in education, that's a separate conversation, but in the startup world, some of what we've been talking about are repeated predictable patterns. And my gut told me that my conversations were repeatable based on all the mentor sessions I had done and being a mentee. I talked to my other mentors, they had the same experience. So what I wanted to do was to create essentially a catalog of those patterns, and then over time, make it smart enough that people could start to use it as an intelligent assistant, and make it open for the public, make it open source, Creative Commons in some form. And so I've started doing that over the years. It's something I named it Collective Leap. It's at collectiveleap.com. If you go there, you'll see the very beginnings of it. But what I'm doing is I'm having multiple mentor sessions where I'm simulating the software I hope to build in my initial conversations with entrepreneurs about, tell me about the users, tell me about their needs, and recognizing what are the patterns. And the purpose of this is, if they can do that before my mentor session, then when they sit down with me or some other mentor, they're already 3 steps ahead because they've looked at the standards and the best practices and said, I'm doing this and this, and I'm confused about that. Help me fit it to my unique case. So, long way to get around to my offer is I set aside time on my daily schedule to mentor folks. I generally get that flow of people from Capital Factory and some of the other programs that I participate in, but I wanted to open it up to your audience. If they're interested, I'll give you the URL. They can sign up for 30 minutes and they'll be one of my test subjects while I give them any feedback that would be useful as a mentor. I'll also be learning about what patterns are relevant and not for them. And, depending upon when they go to that link, I might get to the point where there's some questions they can answer that would start to preload some of the patterns that we could talk about. Right now, I'm just trying to collect people and conversations. So
that's great. Definitely an offer to take advantage of. I'll be including the link in the show notes. So take a look there for more information about getting in contact with Steve. Steve, thanks so much for being on and sharing your story today.
You're welcome. I love doing it. I'm glad to help out.
Join us next week when we talk with an entrepreneur who has a solution to fix a broken food system and use user research to get the message and approach just right.